George R.R. Martin is an avid fan of history. The entire idea of the Game of Thrones is based on the War of Roses, an actual historical battle for succession. There are many parallels to actual history which we plan to cover, but for now let's focus on one. Now, no character in the A Song of Ice and Fire series is a one-to-one recreation of a historical figure, but some characters bear enough similarities for meaningful parallels to be drawn. And this is one of the first that come to mind for me. For the purposes of this video, we're going to be looking at specifically the book version of Tyrion, so here's a quick recap for those who aren't as familiar with him. Tyrion Lannister was born a dwarf to a noble family, making him both highborn and yet also looked down upon due to others in his world considering him to be malformed. On top of that, he's also really ugly, noticeably so. He don't look like no Peter Dinklage. And on top of that, in the Battle of Blackwater, he lost his damn nose, making him look even more horrifying to people. All his ascensions to power are in spite of his condition and looks, because he's just that competent of a person, but the world he lives in refuses to see him as anything but an ugly, conniving dwarf. And that's one aspect of the character the show isn't really capable of covering due to the fact that they chose not to make Tyrion ugly. The stories people tell about Tyrion make him out to be a literal monster, and that perception rules Tyrion's life. Tyrion is easily framed for murder not because he's the most likely person to do it, but because he's an ugly, noseless dwarf, and ugly means evil, and therefore Tyrion is an evil demon monkey who kills his own kin. Richard was born to a royal family in the time of the War of Roses, though he had no deformities according to modern historians. However, that's not what the public has been led to believe for hundreds of years. Dramatizations of his story always portrayed him as disfigured and evil, his deformities representing his inner deviousness. Richard became King of England after his brother and nephews died, though many claimed for years that he murdered them in order to ascend to the throne. The facts of his life aren't really pertinent, however. The most important part is the idea that Richard may have been a very kind-hearted and ultimately innocent man, and the Tudors and others whose agendas this didn't serve chose to portray him as evil and murderous and used deformity to emphasize this evilness. That idea in particular seemed to interest George R. R. Martin when he created Tyrion. The idea that Richard was grotesque and evil has been most spread around by the bard himself, William Shakespeare, in his play Richard III. And while Richard is a great villain with some of Shakespeare's best monologues, it's obviously a piece of propaganda, and it actually worked when it comes to public perception of Richard III, just because his work is that well known nowadays. And funnily enough, in The Winds of Winter, we actually see that there's a play written by a very popular playwright in Bravos that thoroughly demonizes Tyrion. While it hasn't been confirmed by George R. R. Martin himself, it's safe to say this is a not-so-subtle reference to Shakespeare's work on Richard. In a way, while the show downplayed Tyrion's actual physical ugliness, in doing so they've done something very interesting, albeit unintentional. They make a few sly references to Tyrion's book appearances by having people like Cersei comment on rumors made about his looks. And in doing so, they actually created yet another parallel between the real Richard and Tyrion. Now, Richard's story ends with him fighting the last battle of the War of Roses and being killed. Will Tyrion's go a similar way, or will George give Richard's fictional parallel some justice that he couldn't get in the real world? I think we all know what we hope happens, but the more we want something to happen, the more I worry that the exact opposite will actually come to pass.